Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. I thought it would be fun in this episode to answer in more detail a question I get asked a lot and to share a little bit more about my journey to really fixing on soul retrieval as a core of what I most want to offer people in the world. It's really interesting to look back to over 20 years ago and see my younger self first embarking on the path. And so to back up, I had a pretty good childhood, all in all. There were definitely some kerfuffles and some places where needs weren't particularly met. But by the time I ended up in college, I was under an enormous amount of emotional and psychological stress. I had a lot of perfectionism, social anxiety. The social anxiety was profoundly justified because I was remarkably bad at social cues and sustaining connection while so hungry for connection. I had this deep longing to connect in a profound and meaningful way. And at the same time, partly because of my energetic sensitivity, I was so overwhelmed and overstimulated by the world that I was a little bit buffeted by things. And the first couple of years of my experience, I went to UCSD, ended up being a real grace period for me for catching up on some of the social development that I was so behind on by the time I graduated high school. I was definitely less emotionally and socially mature than my peers, even though I was academically quite a bit ahead. And because I went to this teeny tiny high school in the middle of a town with 3 stoplights, I lived out 10 miles beyond that on a little tiny farm. I'd ended up going to some of the local community colleges, and so I was a bit ahead when I came into my freshman year of high school. And what that granted me was the ability, before I hit upper division classes, to be able to squeak by well enough, having always been that straight A student and having taken calculus my senior year. So if you look at my transcripts from college, my first couple of years I got C's in all of my core classes, but fortunately when they average your GPA, they only count upper division classes. And when I hit upper division classes, it became very clear that I was either going to, sit my butt down and work a lot harder than I had been and ever had before, or I wasn't going to get that engineering degree. I wasn't going to, be able to pass the classes. But those first couple of years, I cut a lot of classes and I joined all the clubs. I joined clubs for social justice and environmentalism. I was on the ballroom dance team. I got involved with the Society for Creative Anachronism, the SCA, which is this medieval recreation group that I fell in love with. And one of the really cool, generous aspects about the SCA is how welcoming they are regardless of social awkwardness. It was a place that's extraordinarily inclusive, and that really served me well as kind of a laboratory to start working out this relating to people. And meanwhile, I was so convinced that there was just an easier way to be. So I was seeing therapists and I was working on things, and that was a really useful period. I did a lot of unpacking of some of the less functional patterns, codependency, overgiving, a lot of the strategies that I thought would create connection, what my terms and conditions were, like, I'll show up for you in all these amazing ways, but then you'll have to do this thing for me that the person never signed off on and therefore wasn't available for. I had my first really significant romantic relationships. So, lots of experiences. But after a certain point, I'd got my degree, I'd started working as an engineer, and I'd kind of hit a wall on therapy. I was still going, but I wasn't making the progress that I hoped for, that it seemed like I was earlier on. And one of the turning points in my life was going by a local metaphysical store and going in to get a Reiki treatment. And I'd been going through a lot of stuff. My partner at the time generously, I think, purchased it for me. And I went in feeling heavy and emotionally exhausted and came out feeling amazing. It was such a night and day difference. And it really put me onto and launched me onto my metaphysical path. And I'd already been exploring some of that. I had some people who were Wiccan, but it was interesting, but it wasn't really hitting the spot because for me, it was about the archetype of the healer and the energetic means of healing more than all of the other ways that you can be in touch with your psychic abilities and your magic. Like they're all really cool. But for me, that healing core was really important. And I think I just reached the part where the psychological talk therapy model was what was aligned. And I really needed that energetic intervention that cleared emotional density that I'd been carrying and cleared the weight of different things. So I became very committed to all things metaphysical. I took a ton of classes, and the great thing about having an engineering degree and still thinking I was on a student budget is I had the money to go to weekend workshops, and San Diego at the time was a really rich place. There were an abundance of classes and they were financially very attainable. There was the Learning Annex that put out these great magazines and had things from an evening workshop to a weekend workshop available. And so I was exploring all these things, feng shui, qigong, all of these different healing modalities that I got trained and certified in. And it was really rich and it was very powerful for my own healing. And the Learning Annex ultimately offered a course by Hank Wesselman, who taught 101 Shamanic Journey in a couple of days over a weekend. And that clicked for me more than anything else had because I'd been feeling like I couldn't hear my spirit guides. It felt like everybody was running around saying, Spirit told me this, Spirit told me that. And in retrospect, I see how much my psychic abilities were waking up as I got my Reiki attunements and started to tune in. But it was still a time that my head was really loud. I wasn't very good at distinguishing between projection and perception. And I'm kind of a stubborn person, so I wasn't necessarily taking in as much clear quality feedback as may have been available to me at the time. But the upshot was listening to a drum, going into an altered state, talking to my guides really, really worked for me. It was a potent experience over the workshop. I got a lot out of it and I was really connected to it. And it took me a while to dial in shamanic journeying. So those of you who've been to a workshop, had great results, tried it on your own and got stymied, I relate. It takes a lot more practice and skill and focus to journey on your own behalf by yourself. So it just, it was developing in the background. But the thing that stood out for me in that workshop was Hank Wesselman at the end, almost in passing, mentioned this thing called soul retrieval. And it lit up for me. And I was so excruciatingly shy, very, very shy. And as this shy girl having to walk up to this male authority figure who'd been the teacher all weekend and ask him for information, it wasn't like I could go on the internet at that point. The internet was still, in its baby phases, and find out how I could get in touch with his wife, Jill, who that was what she did. That was her focus. And so I went up and asked for the contact information, very out of character, again, so shy, heart pounding, palm sweating, but I was that magnetized to it and that determined. And so got the number, contacted her. Email was a thing by then, so I reached out via email and told her I'd like to get a soul retrieval. And because of how talented and good she was and what a demand, there was a wait time of 3 or 4 months before I could get an appointment, but I got it on the books. She was in Northern California, fairly close to my parents, so great, I'll fly up, spend time with them, and then drive over and have this experience that I am so drawn to and so compelled by, which was great. And as with anything that really speaks to me, I really want the good for the people that I love. So I reached out to my mom and I told her about this cool thing and invited her to have a session as well. And she said, yeah, sure, absolutely, sounds great. So there followed one of the most intensely distressing and mortifying moments in my life, one of the most intense. Stomach falls, everything knots up. Oh my goodness, I've done a horrible thing. And, I'm kind of laughing about it now because as we know, time plus suffering often makes for good humor. I appreciate, that type of thing as long as the person most effective is laughing later. But it kind of revealed some of the things that I was still working on in therapy. So the way events transpired, I had reached out to Jill. She had written back and said, "What is it that makes you want to get a soul retrieval? Tell me more." And she asked me some questions. And I typed away. I talked about the experiences in my childhood that weren't as needs met and places that I thought I might have lost some soul parts. And I had done a good bit of therapy by then, so I wasn't like, my parents are the worst people ever. I had a more pragmatic, balanced view, which I realized in retrospect. So she replied, okay, great. Here's the logistics. Here's the time for you and your mom, blah, 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 blah. And I did the thing that was our process at that time. My mom had not made friends with email or the internet. She's still, needs a little coaching to send an email. She's getting there. But at the time, the process, my dad worked for Hewlett Packard, so I would email him something, he would print it out, and he'd take it home to mom. And I forwarded the instructions, not realizing that in the email thread were all of my very candid, unedited, not prettied up to make sure they landed with compassionate communication comments about some of the challenges of my childhood that I'd been unpacking in these years of therapy. And so I get a phone call from my mom and she's very stiff and it's really weird and it's charged and I don't know why. And she finally says, "That email you sent." And I'm like, "What? What on earth are you talking about?" I was definitely out of any phase where I was going to go try to be heard by my parents in a really unpalatable way where I accused them of this, that, and the other thing. And so I was just really neutral. And she finally explained about the email, and then I was like, oh my goodness. Not only did my mother see this unedited, which by then I had no idea, what did I say that was so bad? And my dad had clearly potentially read it, because it had gone through his hands, and I was miserable in that moment. I had no idea what I'd said. Mom was clearly upset. One of the things that I was still cleaning up at the time was treating my mom as fragile, level the waters, keep her from being emotional. You could listen to my other podcast on codependency. I learned a lot about it, honestly. But it was a childhood strategy to keep my world level. If mom's emotions are level, everything's going to go a lot better in the household. So contribute to that. So very, very upsetting moment. Was incredibly distressed with a disproportional idea of how much pain I might have caused. And so mom said, "I don't know if I'm going to do the soul retrieval." I'm like, okay, I totally understand. But I was still on track. I still felt totally clear. And the way it worked out was actually really beautiful because my mom had a little bit of time to take a breath, and part of it was revealing privileged family information. There were just some things that my parents wouldn't want strangers to know about. So having learned my lesson, not going to go into it on the podcast. Don't think my parents are regular listeners, but nonetheless, the upshot was after she'd processed, she really went deep and decided it was something she wanted to do. So we went together, and it was this really beautiful healing of both of our wounds, the ancestral wounds, things that had gone before. There was healing for both of us that went really deep. And I had this exquisite experience. I've never actually listened to the recording that was made, but it wouldn't surprise me if I could walk you through line by line. I was so present with this magnificent process, and Jill did an extraordinary job. And then when I came home, come home, big full day, chatted a little bit, had dinner, went off to bed and woke up a few hours later. And I'd stepped out. My parents, had built a beautiful home, lived out in the country, and I stepped out and I'm looking at the stars in the night sky and walking around a little bit because I just felt like I wanted to be in nature so much. And felt the fullness of having my soul parts back because I had lost soul parts right at birth as soon as I came in. And to feel full of my own energy in a way that I had never experienced in my incarnation, and to have the sensitivity and the developed senses to know what that was. There was awe and wonder and tears and gazing up at the night sky and gratitude, and it was extraordinary that the feeling of what had changed really crept up on me. And at the same time, there was this enormous clarity. If I only get to do one thing for someone, I want it to be this, because I'd been practicing all these, other modalities I was learning and training in on anyone who would hold still long enough or was in distress. I volunteered to do Reiki with people with HIV because I didn't have a lot of people who wanted that kind of healing, and they would sign up and were grateful to receive, and it was unpaid, but it was a great chance to get to express and explore these gifts. But what I'd realized with the Reiki is could make someone feel a heck of a lot better in 30 minutes, like massively better. And I still love Reiki. I still do Reiki on myself and treasure the sisters in my social circle to whom I can reach out and say, hey, I could really use a Reiki boost. In fact, if you're like, wow, it would be so great to be able to have someone who could send me Reiki from a distance, send me an email. I have an amazing recommendation from you, somebody who has gone way deeper than I ever did. But absolutely love Reiki, but at the end of the day, the fundamental change of having my soul parts back was something that was so transformative. And that's really why over 20 years later of doing soul retrieval, I'm still so in love with it, because one session can be life-changing. And, from there I explored, I had the opportunity to attend an Alberto Violdo class, and I learned his method of soul retrieval. And then I was like, I don't like it as much. I'm doing something that more closely resembles the Michael Harner Foundation of Shamanic Studies approach, Sandra Ingerman's approach. However, my guides were kind of the people are busy. There isn't time to mess around. So we're going to get all the soul parts back in one sitting. And sure, maybe there's an occasional fragment that, just isn't ready to come back, needs a little more facilitation. But my guides weren't about doing a series of sessions. That wasn't the experience that I had when I received my own soul retrieval. And so I moved forward, and I started, of course, with volunteers. I was like, oh, this is so cool. And people were like, how can we get that? And they weren't able to spend the price tag, or available to spend the price tag of going to Jill or to travel up there. I think she did remote at the time. I don't recall, but I was like, hey, if you want me to try this, I've got a really good connection to my guides. I've studied it. Would you like to receive? And I had a bunch of really eager volunteers, and I got to try it and see how it rippled through their lives. And one gal who, like me, had done a lot of therapy and a lot of work, had been on antidepressants and just weaned herself off. She's like, yeah, I just don't need these anymore. I wish I could say that was like, the result that happens every time, like everyone who struggles with hormonal or mood imbalance, suddenly is free of the need for medication. But it was a really potent confidence builder to have such a measurable result, because often with soul retrieval, it's not so measurable. For some people, if they're really in tune with their energy and they've had a lot of soul loss, there's a big wow factor of what it feels like to have those parts back. But for a lot of people, they're not as attuned with their energy. I was talking to someone recently who just deals with a lot of psychological and emotional issues that are really heavy and really intense. And I've done shamanic work for her, but she doesn't really feel it because what she's dealing with is so loud. It's so loud in her head and her heart that this foundational work isn't really felt. And for some people, they just end up feeling more solid, down the road. They're like, wow, I didn't think much of it at the time, but it has made such a difference. So there's, a lot of variation. I don't want to misrepresent the work that it's fireworks show of life change, but it was a massive pivot point in my life, both as my individual experience. So looking back to that, 18, 19-year-old wide-eyed girl at a college that had an undergraduate population that was way higher than her hometown, going through all the culture shock of, suddenly being at a major university in a big city, who was just so sure that there was a healthier way to be, so sure that I could find a way not to be in so much psychological and emotional pain, who was chasing that so determinedly with no real idea of how to get there. And, there was, and looking back now, there's this vindication of being in my late 40s and having had a number of years stacked together of really thriving in the world, really not having the anxiety, the perfectionism, the self-criticism, the self-doubt. I looked back on some of my early journals and there was so much self-hatred, which I wouldn't have described myself that way, but having moved to the other side of it, there was so much that was unlocked. And I want to be really clear that the therapy I did was valuable. I really, the times where I was sitting on a couch having those conversations, doing the cognitive behavioral therapy was really potent. Also have done somatic release, EMDR, kind of lucked out. I know it's not usual to practice long-term with family members, but my mom got her master's in counseling and went on to study above and beyond that EMDR and somatic experiencing. And so there have been some times where my nervous system was really in a pickle and she could talk me through the unwinding, which has been a magnificent gift. But the shamanic work just moves some things that psychologically and even somatically weren't moving, because I really value working with everything. So my model is very much oriented toward, there's a lot of really cool wisdom in the, psychological model that we have. And there's really cool wisdom in the medical model. There's really cool research. One of my favorite people is Dr. Chatterjee, who has the Feel Better, Live More podcast. And his first book, as it was titled in the UK, The 4 Pillars of Health, which I like better than the US title, which, How to Make Disease Disappear. But either way, really, really cool, awesome. Here's the care and feeding manual that you probably didn't get for how to really help your body thrive on a lot of different levels. Very, very succinct, very on point. And I love the energetic models. I think for most of my clients, if you're just looking at the somatic, the body side of things, for sure, breath work and yoga and things that move energy in the body, those are magnificent. I'm a huge fan. But there's this tending to your soul and essence that I think is so important and so overlooked. So I have a lot of psychologically healthy practices, and yet the person that I go to, one of the best things he does for me is puts eyes on my energy body and sees where maybe I'm not flowing energy through all my chakras, or maybe I've got a power struggle going on, or maybe I've started, reverting to old numbing habits, or there's just something that's out of whack. And then when he eases that back in, there's this magnificent experience of well-being that is opened and unlocked. And I think we all have different secret sauces. I think part of the research and development of being someone in this world with an abundance of practices is really finding your secret sauce. I was working with a client recently who, gosh darn, she has so much willpower. She was sitting down and meditating because she heard it was a good thing to do, even though years of practice and she wasn't getting a lot out of it. And the guides were like, she's not a good candidate for meditation. She's connected to her body. She's the chop wood, carry water, moving meditation person. And if she wants to sit still, it really needs to be outside communing with nature, not on a cushion in a living room, quieting her mind. That's not who she is. Have her circuits flow with movement of her body and connection to the world. This is her medicine. And so we all have different things that resonate, but I wanted to take a podcast episode and just share this journey that I've had with this work that I am still so in love with and so passionate about. If I had my way, everyone would have a soul retrieval so that they were facing the challenges of the world with all of their energy, all of their soul essence that they're supposed to have available. And I really think our shamanic ancestors had that, much more dangerous, difficult world in hunter-gatherer times. People died younger. You can look at the lifespans, infant mortality, all of these kind of things. So I'm a huge fan of having Western medicine and the fact that a smaller percentage of the population of the world have insecure access to food than ever before. It's miraculous. Infant mortality rates have gone down worldwide. There's wonderful gifts of the modern technological era, and I love the connections that we get to have. There's so much about the comfort and safety of the modern world that really allows me to thrive. And there's some stuff that, is really activating to our fight or flight system and needs some adult supervision and can pull us into, all kinds of kerfuffles that our ancestors never would have gotten themselves into. So, it's a mixed bag. I think, being really aware is really good. But one of the things that's just really stood out to me in the last few years as we've gone through COVID and reckoning with racial injustice in the United States, still very much a work in progress, seeing events in the Ukraine and throughout the world, is all the stories of human resilience, and that no matter how much privilege you have, it's still kind of a hard thing to be human. We're looking a lot at where people are less privileged: economic privilege, able-bodied privilege, racial privilege, educational privilege. For sure, all these privileges are really important. Will Wheaton of Star Trek fame and later Big Bang Theory appearances, I get a kick out of some of what he writes, but he was talking about living with crippling depression and anxiety. And he starts off by saying, I really won the lottery on so many things as far as how much privilege, how much economic, and being a white man and having had these extraordinary opportunities. And I still had such a hard time with this really difficult thing. And I loved his both and approach to that. So I would argue that for a lot of us, we really have our plate full with whatever is in our stack, whatever we're dealing with, our complexity of emotionality, the how the care and feeding of the body, whatever we're doing for money. And some people have a much lighter stack. They're blessed with good health or economic accessibility. They're definitely, we can always point to people whose stack seems a lot harder. But I think there's a lot of courage and challenge and intensity just to the fundamental business of being an incarnate human on the planet. And as such, a really big part of my passion is, how do I help someone to have a soul that can be foundational support for their hero's journey of their life or their delicious enjoyment, whatever the chapter is. I think there are hero's journey seasons where we're the courageous person moving forward and being resilient and finding our way. And there's seasons that are really sweet and beautiful and rich. And sometimes those seasons overlap and it's a both and situation. But you may not feel called to soul retrieval. I wish everyone could have it, even if they don't engage deeply, just as a foundational piece. But whatever it is, continuing to ask the question of what can you do to give yourself the most resources of health and well-being, and physical health is a great thing to pay attention to. Emotional health is fantastic and wonderful. And I would offer that soul health is another place that if we're looking at, you know, not as a alleviating karma or clearing past lives, I do those things, I love those things, but as a my core essence is inside of me. My chakras are playing for the same team. They're open, they're vibrant. My energy body is healthy and strong. The outer edge of my auric field doesn't have rips and tears, so it's not permeable. Like, these forms of fundamental health are some of the ones that have the most impact on my outcomes, on how much energy I have. I feel the effects. And unfortunately, when we were in school, things have come a long way. They look for dyslexia. My dad, grew up with mild untreated dyslexia, and his parents were really frustrated. I know you're not dumb. Why are you not doing better in school? And it was interpreted as, he must not be trying hard enough. And that was impactful for him. And for me, I love all the places where we're looking at neurodivergence and how brains work differently and how biochemistry works differently and how abilities work differently. And I think that's wonderful. But I think it hasn't made it into mainstream thinking that energetic sensitivity makes a difference, that there's this part of you that is beautiful. We were the mystics and the shamanic practitioners and sometimes the scholars, the people who had this extra perception in a really big way. Just like, this person who could run really fast might be a really good hunter. This person who has better access to the unseen world has this magnificent gift that can be contributed to the world, but we don't live in structures that are necessarily kind to energetically sensitive people, and it doesn't get diagnosed. I've said often that my outcomes as a child would have been so different if someone had realized I was energetically sensitive, given me the vocabulary for it, so I realized it wasn't just what life was about. I just took it for granted that this overwhelmed, loud experience was really normal. I was dissociative for how overstimulated I was, which is usually a reaction that's caused by major trauma. But for me, it was over energetic stimulation, causing me to leave my body to alleviate the intensity. And so it would have been so cool if someone had told me that I was this thing, energetically sensitive, told me how to put myself in a bubble, and then sat with me and made me practice. Because let's face it, 7-year-old Katie wouldn't have had the discipline to, keep visualizing her bubble, no matter how useful it was. But for going forward in the self-diagnosis, I think that for energetically sensitive people, understanding that part of themselves and knowing what their secret sauce is and how to fast track from, hey, I'm off my center, to, okay, I'm back thriving as efficiently as possible, is a learnable skill and a very, very valuable one, because sometimes it's really trial and error. One of my favorite guilty pleasures, absolutely delighted, big grin on my face about the joy of it, was a TV series called Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. So I love musicals, and it was a musical TV show, but all the songs were about the emotional and psychological complexity of being human and all the messiness and how our heads get loud, put to genre, across all genres and all types of music, songs that were incredibly, poignant and intense and well written. And I just loved the series all the way through. But one of the themes of it was the woman who was the main character realizing, as she started to get some real quality help, that she'd been making these dramatic moves in her life in an attempt to alleviate some really significant untreated mental illness for which she just had a bunch of pills thrown at her, and that there was a trial and error nature to all the things that she'd worked with. And if that's been your journey, I really want to acknowledge it. It was a part of mine. I was such a determined gal in my 20s hunting down these possibilities, and some of them were really potent for moving me forward. Some of them didn't really go anywhere. It was a rich journey, but I just kind of want to offer some of the continuity of my journey. I get asked this a lot, but usually it's like at the end of the session, so I need to give somebody the 5-minute version. And so I just wanted to kind of share and unpack and walk you through this, this journey from starting a practice in my 20s, which, I look at 20-year-olds and I'm like, wow, that was a really young person who had a compelling need to move in a certain direction, because I never really had imposter syndrome. I didn't early on necessarily think I should be paid for it. It was never meant to be financial. It became a business because I wanted to transition eventually as I got some success. It turned into a business along the way. But the vision was always just about wanting so much to contribute and share these gifts. And I threw myself into that really, really headlong. And took me a lot longer. I would argue that from very early on, I was a way better shamanic practitioner than business person, which is not surprising. It took me a while. Last 3 or 4 years, finally really got the entrepreneurship side of it to a really balanced, sustainable place, which I'm really enjoying. I'm really enjoying the work-life balance and not chronically being stressed and fretting about money. After I kind of got to the threshold of enough money, cleaning up my head's loudness about it was a whole nother part of my journey, but I talk about that other places, so I won't go down that rabbit hole. But anyway, if you've listened all the way through, thank you so much for listening. I love that I get to share this. These are some of the things I often get to hear about my clients, but it's kind of fun and yummy to get a chance to share with whoever is listening and feels called to understand a little more deeply what my history is and where I'm coming from. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. Also, a special thank you to my patrons for your support. You offer me the time freedom to work on passion projects like this one. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.